To Hell with Dying by Alice Walker. Mr. Sweet was a diabetic, and an alcoholic and a guitar player, and lived down the road from us on a neglected cotton farm. My older brothers and sisters got the most benefit from Mr. Sweet, for when they were growing up, he had quite a few years ahead of him, and so he was capable of being called back from the brink of death any number of times. Whenever the voice of my father reached him as he lay expiring, "To hell with dying, man," my father would say, pushing the wife out of the way from the bedside, in tears, although she knew the death was not only necessarily the last one, unless Mr. Sweet really wanted it to be. These children want Mr. Sweet, and they did want him. For at a signal from my father, they would come crowding around the bed and throw themselves on the covers, and whoever was the smallest at the time would kiss him all over his wrinkled brown face, and began to tickle him so that he would laugh all the way down to his stomach, and his mustache, which was long and sort of straggly, would shake like Spanish moss, and it was also that color. Mr. Sweet had been ambitious as a boy, wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer or a sailor, only to find that black men fare better if they are not. Since he could become none of these things, he turned to fishing as one of his earnest careers, and playing guitar as his sole claim to doing anything extraordinarily well. His son, the only one that he and his wife, Miss Mary, had, was shiftless as the day is long, spent money as if he were trying to see the bottom of the mint, which Mr. Sweet would tell him was clean as the brown of his palm. Miss Mary loved her baby and worked hard to get him the little necessities of life, which turned out to be mostly women. Mr. Sweet was a tall, thinnish man with thick, kinky hair going dead white. He was dark brown, his eyes were very squinty and sort of bluish. He chewed brown mold tobacco, and he constantly was on the edge of being blind drunk, for he brewed his own liquor, and was not in the least stingy sort of man. He was always very melancholy and sad, though frequently when he was feeling good, he'd dance around the yard with us, usually kneeling over just as my mother came to see what the commotion was. Toward all of us children, he was very kind, and he had the grace to be as shy with us, which is unusual in grown-ups. He had great respect for my mother, for she never held his drunkenness against him, and would let us play with him, even though he was about to fall over in the fireplace from the drink. Although Mr. Sweet would sometimes lose complete or nearly complete control of his head and neck, so that he would loll in his chair, his mind remained strangely acute, and his speech not too affected. His ability to be drunk and sober at the same time made him an ideal playmate, for he was as weak as we were, and we could usually best him in wrestling, all the while keeping a fairly coherent conversation going. Mr. Sweet used to call me his princess, and I believed it. He made me feel pretty at 5 and 6, and simply outrageously devastating at the blazing age of 8.5. When he came to our house with his guitar, the whole family would stop whatever they were doing and sit around him and listen to him play. He liked to play Sweet Georgia Brown. That was what he called me sometimes. And also he liked to play Caldonia and all sorts of sweet, sad, wonderful songs, which sometimes he made up. It was from these songs that I learned that he had to marry Miss Mary when he in fact loved somebody else, now living in Chicago or Detroit, Michigan. He was not sure that Jolie and her baby was also his baby. Sometimes he would cry, and that was an indication that he was about to die again. And so we would all get prepared. We were sure to be called upon. I was 7 the first time I remember actually participating in one of Mr. Sweet's revivals. My parents told me I had participated before. I had been the one chosen to kiss and tickle him long before I knew the rite of Mr. Sweet's rehabilitation. He had come to our house. It was a few years after his wife's death, and he was very sad, and also, typically, very drunk. He sat on the floor next to me and my older brother, and he began to play his guitar and cry. I held his woolly head in my arms, and wished I could have been old enough to have been one of the women that he loved so much, that I had not been lost years and years ago. When he was leaving, my mother said to us that we'd better sleep light, for that night we'd probably have to go over to Mr. Sweet's before the daylight. And we did. For soon after we had gone to bed, one of the neighbors knocked on our door and called my father and said that Mr. Sweet was sinking fast, and if we wanted to get a word in before he crossed over, he'd better shake a leg to get over to Mr. Sweet's house. All the neighbors knew to come to our house if something was wrong with Mr. Sweet. But they did not know how we managed always to make him well, or at least stop him from dying, when he was so often near death. As soon as we heard the cry, we got up. My brother and I and my mother and father put on our clothes. We hurried out of the house and down the road, for we were always afraid that we might someday be too late, and Mr. Sweet would get tired of dallying. When we got to the house, a very poor shack, really, we found the front room full of neighbors and relatives, and a man met us at the door and said that it was all very sad that old Mr. Sweet Little, for Little was his family name, although we mostly ignored it, was about to kick the bucket. He advised my parents not to take my brother and me into the death room, seeing we were so young and all. But we were so much more accustomed to the death room than he thought that we ignored him and dashed in without giving his warning a second thought. I was almost in tears, for these deaths upset me fearfully, and thought of how much depended on me and my brother, who was a ham most of the time, made me very nervous. The doctor was bending over the bed and turned back to tell us for at least the 10th time in history of my family that, alas, old Mr. Sweet Little was dying, and that the children had best not see the face of implacable death. I didn't know what implacable was, but whatever it was, Mr. Sweet was not. My father pushed him, rather abruptly, out of the way, saying, as he always did, and very loud, for he was saying to Mr. Sweet, "To hell with dying, man. These children want Mr. Sweet," which was my cue to throw myself upon the bed and kiss Mr. Sweet all around the whiskers and under the eyes, around the collar of his nightshirt, where he smelled so strongly of all sorts of things, mostly liniment. I was very good at bringing him around, for as soon as I saw that he was struggling to open his eyes, I knew he was going to be all right, and so I could finish my revival sure of success. As soon as his eyes were open, he would begin to smile, and that way I knew that I had surely won. Once, though, I got a tremendous scare, for he could not open his eyes, and later I learned that he had had a stroke, and that one side of his face was stiff and hard to get into motion. When he began to smile, I could tickle him in earnest, because I was sure that nothing would get in the way of his laughter. Although once he began to cough so hard that he almost threw me off his stomach. But that was when I was very small, little more than a baby, and my bushy hair had gotten in his nose. When we were sure he would listen to us, we would ask him why he was in his bed, and when he was coming to see us again, and could we play with his guitar, which, more than likely, would be leaning against the bed. His eyes would get all misty, and he would sometimes cry out loud, but we'd never let it embarrass us. He knew that we loved him, and sometimes we cried too for no reason. My parents would leave the room, just the three of us. Mr. Sweet, by that time, would be propped up in bed with a number of pillows behind his head, and with me sitting and lying on his shoulder, and all along his chest. Even when he had trouble breathing, he would not ask me to get down. Looking into my eyes, he would shake his white head and run a scratchy old finger around my hairline, which was rather low, nearly to my eyebrows, and made some people say I looked like a baby monkey. My brother was very generous in all this. He let me do all the revivaling. He had done it for years before I was born, so was glad to be able to pass it on to someone new. What he would do while I talked to Mr. Sweet was pretend to play the guitar. In fact, pretend that he was a young version of Mr. Sweet, and it always made Mr. Sweet glad to think someone wanted to be like him. Of course, we did not know this then. We played everything by ear, and whatever he seemed to like, we did. We desperately were afraid that he was just going to take off one day and leave us. It did not occur to us that what we were doing was anything special. We had not learned that death was final when it did come. It did not occur to us that we were doing anything special. We had not learned that death was final when it did come. We thought nothing of triumphing over it so many times, and in fact became a little trifle contemptuous of the people who let themselves be carried away. It did not occur to us that if our own father had been dying, we could not have stopped it, that Mr. Sweet was the only person we had power. When Mr. Sweet was in his 80s, I was studying in the university many miles from home. I saw him whenever I went home, but he was never on the verge of dying that I could tell, and I began to feel that my anxiety for his health and psychological well-being was unnecessary. By this time, he had not only a mustache, but was beginning to grow a beard. He was very peaceful, fragile, gentle, and the only jarring note about him was his old guitar, which he still played the old sad, sweet, down-home blues way. On Mr. Sweet's 90th birthday, I was finishing my doctorates in Massachusetts, and had making arrangements to go home for several weeks. That morning, I got a telegram telling me that Mr. Sweet was dying again, and could I please drop everything and come home? Of course I could. My dissertation could wait, and my teachers would understand when I explained this to them after I got back. I ran to the phone, called the airport, and within 4 hours I was speeding along the dusty roads to Mr. Sweet's. The house was more dilapidated than it was when I was there last. It was overgrown with yellow roses, which my family had planted many years ago. The air was heavy and sweet and very peaceful. I felt strange walking through the gate and up the old rickety steps, but the strangeness left me as I caught the sight of the thin body I loved so well beneath the familiar quilt, Mr. Sweet. His eyes were closed tight, and his hands crossed over his stomach were thin and delicate, no longer scratchy. I remember how as a small child I would run and jump on him just anywhere. Now I knew he would not be able to support my weight. I looked around at my parents, and was surprised to see that my father and my mother also looked old and frail. My father, his own hair very gray, leaned over the quietly sleeping old man, who, incidentally, smelled still of sweet wine and tobacco, and said, as he'd done so many times in the past, "To hell with dying, man. My daughter is home to see Mr. Sweet." My brother hadn't been able to come as he was in the war in Asia. I bent down and gently stroked the closed eyes, and gradually they began to open. The closed, wine-stained lips twitched a little, and then parted in a slightly warm, embarrassed smile. Mr. Sweet could see me, and he recognized me, and his eyes looked very spry and twinkly for a moment. I put my head down on the pillow next to his, and we just looked at each other for a long time. Then he began to trace my peculiar hairline with a thin, smooth finger. I closed my eyes when his finger halted above my ear. He used to rejoice at the dirt in my ears when I was little. His hand stayed cupped around my cheek. When I opened my eyes, sure that I had reached him in time, his were closed. Even at 24, how could I believe that I had failed? That Mr. Sweet was really gone? He had never gone before. But when I looked up at my parents, I saw that they were holding back tears. They had loved him dearly. He was like a piece of rare and delicate china, which was always being saved from breaking, and which it finally fell. I looked long at the old face, the wrinkled forehead, the red lips, the hands that still reached out to me. Soon I felt my father pushing something cool into my hands. It was Mr. Sweet's guitar. He had asked them months before to give it to me. He had known that even if I came the next time, he would not be able to respond in the old way. He did not want me to feel that my trip had been for nothing. The old guitar. I plucked the strings and hummed Sweet Georgia Brown. The magic of Mr. Sweet lingered in the smooth wooden box. Through the window, I could catch the fragrant, delicate scent of the tender yellow roses. The man on the high old-fashioned bed, with the quilt coverlet and the glowing white hair, had been my first love.